The late morning sun washed through the Seabreeze diner, softening the chrome and warming the yellow booths. It looked like an ordinary day, but for Sophie Carter, it was another quiet battle. Bills, exhaustion, and her mother's needs weighed heavily, until three laughing men walked in. If you believe in compassion, hope, and second chances, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories. Let's begin. The late morning sun streamed through the Seabreeze diner's tall windows, painting warm gold across the checkered floors. But no amount of sunlight softened the heaviness inside Sophie Carter. She moved between tables with the quiet determination of someone carrying far more than she ever admitted. Rent was late again. Her mother's medication cost more than Sophie earned in a week, and the exhaustion of juggling long shifts and sleepless nights showed in the faint shadows under her eyes. Still, she greeted each customer with a soft smile, holding herself together with fragile grace. She had survived harder days, she reminded herself. All she needed was for this one to stay predictable. But life had its own plans, and 1 hour from now, Sophie would face a moment that would test everything she'd been fighting to hold in place. The familiar chime of the diner door rang out, but the sound was followed by loud, careless laughter that made Sophie instinctively straighten. Three sharply dressed men stepped inside: Ethan, Blake, and Connor. Their confidence filled the room like a perfume no one wanted to smell. Expensive suits, polished shoes, and egos that seemed to arrive ahead of them. They slid into a booth near the window with the entitlement of people raised believing the world belonged to them. Sophie, steadying her notepad, forced her shoulders to relax. She had served rude customers before, but something about these three felt sharp, like cold wind blowing under a door. Still, she approached with her usual warmth. They barely glanced at her as they ordered the most expensive dishes, speaking over her as if she were simply another part of the decor. As Sophie delivered steaming plates to their table, the men's amusement grew louder. Blake pointed at her apron, stained from a spilled coffee earlier, and snickered to the others. Ethan made a remark about how some people clearly weren't aiming high in life, and Connor asked with a smirk if she had ever considered another career, like disappearing. Each comment landed like a sting, though Sophie kept her composure. She'd learned long ago that reacting only fed people like them. But today, her heart was too worn, her body too tired, her spirit too fragile to endure their cruelty unnoticed. Still, she swallowed the humiliation. She needed this job, needed the tips, needed to keep breathing through the ache. Yet underneath her quiet expression, something inside her trembled, because she felt utterly alone. When the trio finished their meal, Sophie gathered her courage and approached with the bill. Connor barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward her with 2 fingers. "Why would we pay for poor service?" he said, loud enough for several customers to hear. Blake leaned back, chuckling. "Maybe she thinks wearing an apron gives her authority." Ethan added one more blow. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just having fun." Sophie felt her throat tighten. The diner seemed to hush around her. Conversations dulled, forks paused midair, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her humiliation unfold. She tried to speak, tried to steady her voice, but nothing came out. Shame washed over her in a thick, suffocating wave. She felt small, smaller than she'd felt in years. She didn't deserve this. But she stood frozen, unsure how to escape the moment without making everything worse. Then, something shifted, so subtly that Sophie sensed it before she saw it. A silence settled behind the men, heavy enough to interrupt even their arrogance. A tall, composed man stood there, dressed in a deep charcoal suit. Silver hair, calm eyes, posture steady as stone. Jonathan Pierce. Most people didn't know his face. Fewer knew he privately owned the entire Seabreeze diner chain. He preferred to observe quietly, staying out of the spotlight. But today, fate placed him exactly where Sophie needed someone to stand. Jonathan's expression wasn't angry, it was disappointed. And somehow, that disappointment carried more weight than any raised voice. Customers exchanged glances. Even the air felt different, like justice itself had stepped into the room. Sophie didn't know who he was, but she felt something she hadn't felt all day, the faint, fragile sense that she wasn't alone. Ethan finally noticed Jonathan reflected in the window, and the color drained from his face. Blake straightened abruptly, and Connor's smirk collapsed entirely. Jonathan didn't need to raise his voice. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm, but undeniably firm. The men scrambled for excuses, but Jonathan's eyes held them still. In seconds, they reached for their wallets. Their arrogance had evaporated into thin air. They paid the full bill, and then added more than enough to cover their guilt. Nearby customers watched in quiet satisfaction. Some even nodded subtly, grateful that someone had stepped in where they hadn't dared. Sophie stood still, stunned, breath finally loosening in her chest. She wasn't sure what astonished her more, the sudden justice or the overwhelming relief of finally being defended. When the men hurried out, Jonathan finally turned towards Sophie. His expression softened instantly. "You handled that with dignity," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" The kindness in his voice felt like warm light breaking through clouds. Sophie blinked rapidly, fighting tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed all morning. People had dismissed her, ignored her, talked over her, but this man looked at her with respect, not pity. A simple acknowledgement, yet it reached deeper than any apology those men could have offered. She nodded shakily. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonathan gave a small, respectful nod, one that told her she mattered, her efforts mattered, her presence mattered. It was astonishing how one small moment of decency could restore a part of the heart she thought was lost. As the diner settled back into its usual rhythm, the world felt a little brighter to Sophie. She didn't know Jonathan Pierce would later call the manager to discuss working conditions. She didn't know he would quietly look into her family's struggles or that he would take steps to ease their burden. All she knew was that someone had stood up for her when she had no strength left. Someone had reminded her that kindness wasn't extinct, that compassion still lived in unexpected corners of everyday life. This moment, simple yet profound, became the beginning of Sophie's slow but meaningful transformation. A reminder that even on the hardest days, hope can appear in the form of a single person who chooses to care. Thanks for being here. Like and subscribe to keep more unforgettable stories coming.